The village sat nestled in the rugged hills of rural Spain, a place so isolated that time itself seemed to bypass it. It was not marked on most maps, and even the locals referred to it with a sense of mystery, as if it were a place detached from the rest of the world. Its narrow, unpaved roads wound through barren terrain, often disappearing into thick forests or steep inclines. The isolation was its defining feature, and for centuries, it had kept its residents hidden from the influence of outsiders. For those who dared venture close enough to see it, the village was a portrait of another age, a world trapped in its own moment of history, untouched by the progression of the outside world. In 1901, when the rest of Spain was beginning to see the stirrings of modernization, the village remained steadfast in its detachment. The pace of life was slower here, dictated by the natural rhythms of the land. There were no bustling markets or grand city halls. No railroads or telegraphs brought news of the outside world. It was a place where life had continued, almost unchanged, for generations. The villagers lived in small stone houses, tended to their farms, and adhered to a set of traditions and customs passed down through centuries, never once considering that the world beyond their borders was evolving in ways they could scarcely imagine. The people of this village were different, though not in the way one might think. They were not particularly hostile toward outsiders, but their lives had simply been shaped by a set of rules that kept them isolated. A deep, unspoken rule was in place that dictated who they could marry, who they could interact with, and, most importantly, who they could trust. It was a world of inherited customs and family lines that, over time, had grown more and more insular. The village had no formal government, no law enforcement, and certainly no outside intervention. Everyone knew their place, and everyone had a role to play in maintaining the structure of this secluded society. What set this village apart, though, was not simply its physical isolation. It was the story of a single bloodline, a family whose existence within this world was so deeply entwined with the land and its customs that it had become something almost mythical. The family had lived in this village for generations, never once venturing outside its boundaries, and, in turn, never once allowing outsiders to step foot within their domain. For decades, the bloodline had remained a sealed, self-contained unit, a closed system that existed apart from the rest of the world. They did not intermingle with the other families of the village in the usual way. They did not make friends, did not engage in social activities, and certainly did not marry outside of their own family. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about this family. They appeared to be like any other rural family, living off the land, abiding by the same customs as their neighbors. But beneath the surface, something darker was at play. As generations passed, the family remained firmly ensconced in its isolation, marrying within itself, a practice that had become more common over time. Each new generation became more tightly bound to the land, to their ancestors, and to each other. The sense of mystery surrounding the family deepened with every passing year. They were known as the old blood of the village, a phrase that carried with it both reverence and fear. The villagers, despite their proximity, knew little about them, save for whispers about their strange ways and peculiar behavior. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the outside world began to take an interest in this family. The advent of modern communication had made the world smaller, and news began to travel faster. One fateful event, a visitor from outside the village, would set into motion a chain of events that would unravel the secrets of this isolated bloodline. But even before this, rumors had begun to surface about the family's reclusive nature. People in nearby towns spoke of them in hushed tones, with some even claiming that their way of life was not only unusual but unnatural. They were considered a curiosity, a relic from a bygone era. The villagers themselves were divided in their opinions of the family. Some viewed them as the last guardians of an old way of life, untouched by the influences of modernity and progress. They were, in many ways, the villagers' living history, preserving traditions that had long been forgotten elsewhere. Others, however, found their insular ways to be unsettling, even frightening. The fact that they never married outside the family, that they never interacted with the rest of the community in any meaningful way, left many questioning their motives. There were stories of strange practices, of rituals and customs that seemed to have no place in the modern world. People in the neighboring towns would talk about the family's oddities, about the strange customs that set them apart from everyone else. But no one could say for certain what went on behind the walls of the family stone house, a house that was said to be both forbidding and magnificent, filled with generations of family heirlooms and relics of a time that had long since passed. The mystery surrounding the family grew as the years wore on. When outsiders did arrive, they were met with suspicion, and the family kept to themselves even more than ever. There were even instances of people being turned away at the gates of the family's estate, never once allowed to step inside. It was as if the family's very existence was a closed book, and they were the only ones with the key. As time went on, rumors of extreme inbreeding began to circulate, though they were never confirmed. It was said that the family's isolation had led to a tragic cycle of genetic disorders, and that each new generation was more physically and mentally impaired than the last. Yet, despite the growing whispers, no one outside the family could verify the truth. In this way, the village remained suspended in its own reality, a place where the passage of time seemed almost irrelevant. The villagers continued with their daily lives, their traditions, and their work, while the family in question remained a dark and troubling enigma at the edge of their world. The isolation of the village, the secrecy of the family, and the unspoken rules that governed their lives were all part of a larger narrative that was slowly beginning to emerge from the shadows. The year 1901 marked a turning point in the history of this isolated village, though it would take years for the full extent of the family's isolation, and its consequences, to be understood. The outside world was beginning to reach the village in ways that had never been seen before. The technology of communication, the spread of industrialization, and the rapid growth of cities were all slowly encroaching on the village's peaceful, secluded existence. But despite the world changing around them, the village remained a place apart, holding onto its secrets, its traditions, and its dark legacy. The family's story, however, was about to unfold in ways no one could have imagined. As the outside world began to look in, the family's insular world was about to collide with the reality of modern science, medicine, and the ethics of genetic research. But this was still many years off. For now, in 1901, the family remained a shadow in the hills, a silent, unsettling presence that no one dared approach too closely. The bloodline that had never interacted with outsiders was still firmly entrenched in its isolation, bound by the invisible threads of custom and secrecy, a relic of a time that was quickly disappearing. The true extent of what had been hidden in this isolated village, in the folds of this secluded bloodline, was still to be discovered. But one thing was certain: their story, a dark and mysterious tale of isolation, family, and genetic inheritance, was not just a piece of local folklore, it was a tragedy waiting to be uncovered. At the turn of the 20th century, Spain was a nation teetering on the edge of change. The social, political, and economic landscapes of Europe were shifting, and the echoes of industrialization, modernity, and scientific advancement were reverberating across the continent. But for much of rural Spain, life moved at a different pace. In the cities of Madrid, Barcelona, and Seville, people were starting to experience the wonders of the modern world: electricity, trains, the telephone, and advances in medicine. Spain, a country that had been deeply influenced by its rich history of empire and religious tradition, was now grappling with the forces of progress. But even as these transformations swept through the cities, large parts of the countryside remained untouched, caught in the grip of centuries-old customs, traditions, and isolation. It was in this setting, one of stark contrasts between progress and tradition, that the story of a village lost to time begins. This village, located in the rural heart of Spain, seemed almost like a world apart, disconnected from the sweeping changes taking place elsewhere. The roads that led into the village were narrow and unpaved, often obscured by thick forests and rugged terrain. Access to the outside world was scarce, and most inhabitants had never traveled beyond the hills that surrounded their homes. For centuries, the village had existed in a delicate balance, an insular society that had been both untouched and unknown to the broader world. While much of Spain was slowly entering the modern era, rural communities like this one remained heavily influenced by older ways of life. The villagers, who lived off the land, sustained themselves through farming, livestock, and a deeply ingrained sense of community. Their way of life was founded on a rigid hierarchy of family ties and traditions, and the rhythms of the seasons governed everything. Life was hard, often marked by poverty and limited resources. Yet, there was a simplicity and a peace that permeated these mountain villages, a sense of timelessness that made them seem as though they were caught in an eternal past. In these areas, the impact of industrialization was almost invisible, with no factories, no major transportation routes, and no modern conveniences. For the villagers, the outside world might as well have been a distant memory. The social structure in these isolated rural areas was often more hierarchical and rigid than in the cities. Villages were governed by unwritten codes, old laws rooted in tradition and religion, passed down over generations. They were insular communities in every sense, with little to no outside influence creeping in. Life was governed by family, and family was everything. Marriages were often arranged based on deep-rooted local customs, not romantic love or personal choice. These unions were typically between families that had lived in the same village for centuries, ensuring that the bloodlines remained pure and undiluted. The concept of outsiders, people who came from other towns or regions, was foreign to them, and there was little to no desire to interact with the broader world. This closed mindset had worked for generations, but it would not remain unchallenged for long. The historical context of Spain at the time, particularly in rural areas, was one of stagnation. The country had endured decades of political turmoil, with frequent changes in leadership, wars, and internal strife. The late 19th century had seen Spain's empire crumble, losing most of its colonies and facing growing discontent at home. Despite these struggles, rural Spain remained largely unaffected by the political shifts taking place in the capital. In the countryside, the focus was on surviving each day, managing crops, and maintaining the family legacy. People were accustomed to hardship, to a life of toil, and to the unchanging nature of their surroundings. In this sense, they lived in a parallel world, disconnected from the historical upheavals that mark Spain's broader trajectory. For many in the cities, Spain was changing in dramatic ways. The advent of industrialization and the rapid spread of new technologies had begun to reshape the nation's economy, especially in urban areas. Railways connected cities, allowing people to travel farther and faster than ever before. In the cities, intellectuals and artists were beginning to experiment with new ideas about society, politics, and culture. Spain was gradually moving into the modern age, driven by these new developments. Yet, just outside these urban hubs, entire swathes of the country remained unchanged, untouched by the hand of modernity. It was in this environment that the village, and its secretive family, continued to thrive, or rather, to survive. While the rest of the world was forging ahead, embracing new technologies, and expanding its horizons, this rural village remained trapped in the past. Its residents lived in near total isolation, isolated by both geography and mindset. Life here was cyclical and self-contained, when nothing much changed from one generation to the next. Families lived in close-knit clusters, with marriages often arranged between cousins or even closer relatives. The notion of expanding beyond one's bloodline was foreign to the people, who saw their way of life as natural and unchanging. They were deeply embedded in a system of tradition and family ties that stretched back for centuries. Outsiders, especially those from distant cities or foreign lands, were considered strange, unwelcome, and even dangerous. For the villagers, the outside world held little interest. To them, the rapid changes occurring in the cities seemed irrelevant, or worse, threatening. The advent of new technologies, such as the telephone or electricity, was met with skepticism, if not outright resistance. This was a place where tradition was king, where the past held more power than any innovation. In the villages, people held on to the old ways, traditional farming methods, ancient religious practices, and rituals passed down through the ages. Modern life, with its promise of convenience and progress, had little place here. It was a village frozen in time, untouched by the rushing tide of change that had engulfed much of Europe. But the family at the center of this story did not simply embody this resistance to the modern world. They were its embodiment. The family, an ancient bloodline that had lived in the village for generations, had become a symbol of something even more extreme, a complete and total withdrawal from the world outside. Unlike most families in the village, who interacted with others and maintained at least a modicum of social connection, this family had retreated entirely. They married only within their own ranks, preserving their bloodline but also ensuring their insularity. For decades, the family remained separate from the rest of the village, never mingling, never reaching out. They were the ghostly presence at the edge of the community, a family bound by their own set of rules and traditions, some of which had long since been forgotten by others. It wasn't merely the family's reluctance to engage with the outside world that made them stand out. It was the extreme nature of their isolation. While many rural families might have been cut off from the world by geography, this family had taken it a step further, deliberately shutting themselves off from anyone or anything that could disrupt their way of life. They had rejected the very idea of progress, of mingling with outsiders, of mixing blood with any outside family. For them, this was not just a matter of tradition, it was a matter of survival. Their family was their world, and everything outside of it was to be kept at bay. It was in this context of rural stagnation, where tradition reigned and progress was seen with suspicion, that the family began to show the darker side of its insular existence. The isolation that had once been a source of pride slowly transformed into something more insidious. By the early 20th century, the genetic consequences of their isolation were beginning to manifest in ways that were hard to ignore. But at the time, no one knew the full extent of what was happening in this isolated corner of Spain. The people of the village could not have known that the family's refusal to engage with the outside world would lead to a tragedy of genetic proportions. For now, however, the family's story remained a mystery, a secret hidden in the hills of rural Spain. Their way of life continued as it always had, insulated from the forces of change and untouched by the world outside. But change was inevitable, and the family's carefully maintained isolation could not last forever. Their quiet existence, hidden away in the forgotten corners of the Spanish countryside, was about to be shattered by forces they could neither anticipate nor control. The village was an enigmatic place, nestled so deep within the rugged terrain of rural Spain that it felt like a forgotten world, lost in time. The narrow, winding paths that led to it seemed almost like secret roads, built by the land itself to hide the village from the wider world. Surrounded by steep cliffs, dense forests, and hills that rolled like a sea of green, the village had remained practically untouched by the outside world for centuries. It was the sort of place where the old ways of life were still lived in full, where technology had barely made an impression, and where history lingered in the air like the scent of damp earth. Time seemed to have little relevance here. It was as if the village was stuck in a perpetual loop, circling back to the same place every day. The isolation was more than physical. It was deeply social. The villagers were bound together not just by geography but by centuries-old traditions that created an almost impenetrable barrier to the outside world. There was little to no outside contact, and the concept of strangers was so foreign that it was almost terrifying. The villagers went about their daily lives in a rhythm that had changed little over the centuries. They lived in stone houses, their roofs covered with moss and lichen, a testament to the passage of time. The houses were small, humble, and clustered close together, creating a sense of a tight-knit, insular community where everyone knew everyone's business. These homes were not merely structures, they were part of the village's identity, built from the earth around them and crafted with hands that knew nothing of modern tools or machinery. The village was a place where farming was the backbone of life. Fields of wheat, barley, and rye stretched out as far as the eye could see, and every family worked the land to support themselves. Cattle, sheep, and goats grazed lazily on the hillsides, providing the villagers with milk, meat, and wool. The rhythms of nature were their only guide: the seasons, the rain, the heat of the summer, and the bitter cold of the winter. Everything in the village was dictated by the natural world. There were no clocks, no calendars, just the timeless cycle of birth, growth, death, and renewal. Life was simple, but it was also incredibly hard. The harshness of the landscape and the isolation of the village meant that the villagers had to rely on one another for survival. There was little room for outsiders, and the few who tried to make their way into the village were met with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Despite this apparent simplicity, the village was not without its complexities. Its people lived by codes of behavior and belief that had been passed down through generations. These were not laws in any formal sense, but rather the unspoken rules that governed every aspect of life. One of the most important of these rules was the concept of family, which held an almost sacred place in the villagers' hearts. Family was not just a social unit, it was the very foundation of the community. The bonds between family members were seen as sacred, unbreakable, and immutable. Marriage was a union not just between two individuals but between two bloodlines. Families that had lived in the village for generations were highly protective of their own, and the idea of marrying outside the community was unthinkable. In this village, outsiders were a rare and unwelcome sight. Visitors who arrived from neighboring towns or even the nearest city would often be greeted with suspicion. Their strange clothes, unfamiliar accents, and curiosity about the customs of the village set them apart, and it didn't take long for word to spread that they were different, that they didn't belong. Most of the time, outsiders were turned away before they even had the chance to settle in. The villagers believed that to maintain their way of life, they had to remain pure, untouched by the corruption of the outside world. This belief was rooted deeply in their customs and traditions, which were built around an ideal of self-sufficiency and isolation. To them, the world beyond their village was dangerous, full of influences that could break apart their carefully maintained way of life. And so, the villagers kept to themselves, building an insular existence that could only be disrupted by the forces of time or nature. But it was not just outsiders who were kept at arm's length. The villagers, too, were bound by their own set of invisible rules, drawn from generations of history and tradition. They rarely married outside their families. Marriages were arranged, and even when love did play a role, it was always secondary to the concept of bloodlines. Families intermarried with one another, maintaining ties to their ancestors and ensuring that the bloodline stayed pure. In a way, the concept of family was so strong that it became the very defining characteristic of the village. The family you were born into determined your place in society, your relationships, and your future. There was little room for individuality. Everyone played a part in the larger tapestry of the community. To deviate from these norms was seen as a betrayal of the traditions that had kept the village alive for so long. This tight-knit, family-centered existence, while protective, also had darker undercurrents. Over the generations, as families intermarried within the community, the bloodlines became more and more intertwined. Each new generation was born into a web of relationships that was so complicated that they could hardly be untangled. And as the practice of marrying within the village became more entrenched, the potential for genetic consequences grew. Yet, in a place where tradition ruled above all, there was little thought given to the potential dangers of such practices. It was simply how things were done. The notion of marrying someone from outside the village, someone who was not of their blood, not part of their family, was unthinkable. To do so would have been seen as an affront to the village's very identity, a violation of the sacred bond that tied them all together. This practice of marrying within the community was not unique to this village. Many rural communities in Spain, and indeed across Europe, adhered to similar customs. But in this particular village, the effect was compounded by the extreme isolation of the area. The harsh geography made it nearly impossible for anyone to come and go freely, and the deep sense of loyalty to family and tradition further sealed the fate of those who lived there. They were a self-contained world, where the outside world hardly seemed to exist. And so, the generations passed, one after another, with the same families marrying within themselves, keeping the bloodlines pure but also, unknowingly, setting the stage for a tragedy of genetic consequence. For the family at the center of this story, their isolation was both a blessing and a curse. 4 generations, they had lived in this village, never venturing far from the hills and valleys that had sustained them. Their house, an imposing stone structure built into the side of the mountain, was as much a part of the landscape as the trees and the rocks that surrounded it. It stood as a silent testament to their long history, a place where the family had lived, worked, and thrived for as long as anyone could remember. The house, like the family itself, was old and weathered, yet it stood firm against the elements. It was a symbol of continuity, of a way of life that had remained unchanged for generations. And it was within these walls that the family's darkest secrets were kept. The family, though revered and respected for their long lineage, had come to embody the very isolation that the village held so dear. They had cut themselves off from the rest of the world, not just physically but emotionally and psychologically as well. They did not socialize with others. They did not form close bonds with their neighbors. They kept to themselves, only interacting with others when absolutely necessary. Their insularity had become part of their identity, a shield that protected them from the world outside. But it also allowed something darker to take root. As the family continued to marry within itself, generation after generation, the toll of inbreeding began to manifest. The genetic consequences of their isolation were subtle at first, small, almost imperceptible changes that went unnoticed by most. But over time, these changes grew more pronounced. Physical and mental health began to deteriorate, and the signs of genetic disorders became impossible to ignore. Yet, the family continued their way of life, never questioning the practices that had kept them so secluded, so isolated. To them, it was all part of the natural order, the way things had always been. It was not until much later, when the outside world began to notice, that the true scope of the damage became clear. But by then, it was too late to reverse the course that had been set long ago. The village's dark secret was about to be laid bare for all to see, and there was no turning back. The family at the heart of this mystery had long been a subject of whispers, a topic of quiet speculation among the villagers. They were known as the Old Blood, a title that evoked both reverence and unease. For generations, they had lived in the same stone house, perched on the edge of the village like a forgotten relic from another time. The family's house, although humble in its own way, was imposing enough to make a statement. Its thick stone walls, weathered by years of exposure to the elements, seemed to absorb the very essence of the land, while its jagged roofline stretched out against the backdrop of the hills and sky. This house, isolated from the rest of the village, was more than just a home. It was a symbol of the family's indomitable place in the village's history. But beyond the structure's intimidating appearance, it held secrets that would only come to light much later. At the center of this family was the patriarch, a man whose name was spoken with a mix of respect and fear. He had inherited the house from his ancestors, just as they had inherited it from theirs. He had lived a life that followed the rhythm of the land, his every movement tied to the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvesting, and the familial obligations that came with being the head of the household. The patriarch's life, while seemingly ordinary, was defined by a singularity of purpose, the preservation of his family's bloodline. His marriage, like all those before him, was arranged with the expectation that his wife would provide him with children who would carry on the legacy of his ancestors. And just as his ancestors had done, the patriarch and his wife adhered to the unspoken rules of the village, marrying within the family, keeping their bloodline pure, and living a life that was closed off from the rest of the world. In his younger years, the patriarch had been a man of great vigor, his hands strong from years of working the fields and his voice deep and commanding, echoing across the hills as he called out to his children or made his demands known to the few people who dared visit. He was known for his stern nature, his unyielding determination to keep the family's affairs in order. There was little room for sentimentality in his world. He had been raised to understand that the survival of the family was the highest calling, and everything else, personal desires, emotions, friendships, came second to that. His children, as they grew older, were raised with this same understanding, and the idea of marriage within the family was never questioned. It was simply the way things had always been done. The patriarch's children, much like him, were raised in the shadow of tradition. The eldest son, who would eventually inherit the family estate, was groomed from a young age to carry on the legacy. His training began early, learning to tend the land, to care for the animals, and to uphold the values that had been instilled in him. The other children, though not in line to inherit the estate, were similarly taught to maintain the family's way of life. Their marriages, too, would be arranged, but there was an unspoken understanding that the family would remain within the fold. No outsider could be allowed to disrupt the purity of their bloodline. But while the children were raised with these expectations, it was the daughters of the family who carried the most weight in the unfolding story. As was common in such isolated communities, the daughters were often married off at a young age, not for love or personal choice, but for the good of the family. The idea of romantic love was foreign to them. Marriage was a business transaction, a continuation of bloodlines, and a means to secure the family's future. The daughters of this family were no exception. They were raised to understand that their purpose was to marry within their bloodline, to produce children, and to continue the cycle that had been established long ago. It was not a life of personal fulfillment, but one of duty and obligation. As the years passed, the family grew larger, and the house became filled with more children, more voices, and more pressure to maintain the family's tradition of isolation. Each new generation was born into this world, raised under the same roof, and taught the same values. Over time, the family became even more insular, and the bonds that tied them together grew stronger and more tangled. The practice of marrying within the family had become so entrenched that it was no longer questioned. It was simply the way things were, and had been for generations. The concept of leaving the village, of marrying someone from another town or city, was seen as a betrayal, an act of defiance against the traditions that had kept the family alive. But as with all closed systems, the family's insularity began to take a toll. What had once been a natural way of life slowly became a trap. The more the family intermarried, the more their genetic pool narrowed. What had once been a strong, healthy bloodline began to show signs of weakening. The first signs were subtle, slightly odd physical features, small mental or emotional disorders that went unnoticed by most. But as the generations continued, these signs became more pronounced. The family's genetic legacy, once a source of pride, had become a source of concern. And yet, despite the growing evidence of harm, no one spoke of it. The family's insular nature meant that the truth was hidden behind closed doors, shielded by a wall of silence. To the outside world, the family remained a mystery. The villagers, though aware of their peculiar ways, were too entrenched in their own lives to give much thought to the specifics of the family's isolation. The family's house was a place that people rarely ventured, and when they did, they were met with coldness and reluctance. The family members were polite but distant, never engaging in the sorts of social interactions that were common in the village. They were not unfriendly, but they made it clear that they were not interested in participating in the life of the community. They kept to themselves, focused on the land, their traditions, and their family. The few times outsiders came into contact with the family were often unsettling experiences. There was something about them, something not quite right, that made people uncomfortable. Their eyes, too keen and too distant, their posture too stiff, and their mannerisms too controlled. All of these subtle signs combined to create an air of strangeness. It was as if they were not quite human, as if their existence was tied to something beyond the realm of ordinary life. The family had long since ceased to be just a family. They had become something more. They were a symbol of something ancient, something that had been preserved through generations of isolation. The patriarch, now older and frailer, had grown more rigid in his ways. His voice, once strong and commanding, had become softer, but his resolve had not wavered. He continued to oversee the family's affairs with an iron grip, making sure that the traditions were upheld, that the bloodline was preserved, and that nothing disrupted the order he had established. He was determined to see his legacy carried on, to ensure that the family's way of life would survive long after he was gone. But even as the patriarch's grip on the family grew stronger, the cracks in the bloodline became harder to ignore. The consequences of generations of inbreeding began to manifest in more obvious ways. Children were born with deformities, both physical and mental, their health deteriorating faster than should have been expected. The family's once pristine bloodline was now a shadow of its former self, ravaged by years of isolation and intermarriage. But despite the obvious signs of damage, no one in the family spoke of it. The silence was deafening, a silence that had been cultivated over generations. The family's refusal to confront the truth of their situation, to acknowledge the damage that had been done, created an environment of denial. The patriarch, in his old age, could not bring himself to see what was happening to his family, to the bloodline that he had worked so hard to preserve. His focus remained on maintaining the traditions, on keeping the family intact, no matter the cost. The family had become a living monument to isolation, a monument that, like the house they lived in, was slowly crumbling under the weight of its own history. The tragic truth of the family's existence was that, despite their efforts to preserve their way of life, they were living in a cycle that was doomed to repeat itself, with each generation suffering the consequences of the choices made by those who came before them. And so, as the years passed and the family's grip on reality tightened, the house stood as a silent witness to their decline. The village, too, watched from a distance, unaware of the dark secret that was slowly unraveling in their midst. The family had become a relic, a shadow of a bygone era, preserved not by choice, but by the weight of generations of tradition and isolation. Their story was not one of triumph or legacy, but of tragedy, of a family that had trapped itself in the very traditions it sought to protect, and in doing so, had condemned itself to a fate from which there was no escape. The external world's curiosity about the family's secluded existence was a slow burn, beginning in whispers but gradually growing louder, as small sparks of intrigue ignited the imagination of those from neighboring villages and beyond. What had once been regarded as an eccentricity or a curious relic of an old way of life became something more, a subject of fascination, something that people could not stop discussing. The family's refusal to mingle with the outside world, their firm belief in maintaining an undiluted bloodline, only deepened the mystery surrounding them. To many, the family's closed-off nature became something of an enigma, one that triggered not just gossip but the uneasy feeling that something was terribly wrong behind the walls of their ancient stone house. Though most outsiders had never even crossed the threshold of the village, their tales of the family's oddities were enough to ignite curiosity. When news of their isolation spread to nearby towns, it created a sense of mystique, like a haunting legend that could never be fully understood. It was said that the family never ventured beyond the boundaries of their land. They would not come to town for market day or religious gatherings. Even in times of hardship, when other villagers came together to offer assistance or support, the family remained apart, refusing any help or outside influence. Their insularity was as impenetrable as the thick forest that surrounded their home. For some, the very thought of such isolation seemed unnatural. How could a family live so completely cut off from the outside world and still thrive? And yet, they did. At first, the villagers were merely puzzled by the family's ways. The belief in preserving the bloodline, the marriage customs, the refusal to engage with outsiders, it all seemed, to them, a strange but harmless eccentricity. Many, perhaps even most, did not question the family's actions. There was a certain respect, even admiration, for the family's ability to maintain their traditions and live outside the pressures of modern life. For them, the family represented the preservation of something pure, an old, nearly forgotten way of life that had endured for centuries. But this view was not universal. There were others in the village who found the family's refusal to integrate into the community unsettling, even dangerous. It was one thing to live a life of tradition and simplicity, to hold on to old customs and beliefs in a rapidly changing world. But to avoid any interaction with other people, to refuse to participate in the shared life of the village, began to seem like an act of defiance, a refusal to acknowledge the broader social contract that bound the villagers together. It was not that the family was malicious, at least, not in the traditional sense, but their detachment made many uncomfortable. The village was a small, interconnected place. People were dependent on one another for survival. There were no barriers between families, no real sense of division. So, the family's insularity felt like a silent judgment, an implied rejection of the communal fabric that bound everyone else together. Over time, the suspicions grew. A few outsiders ventured close to the village, drawn by the increasingly bizarre rumors circulating in nearby towns. What they heard was disturbing: tales of strange rituals, of customs that seemed to have no explanation, of people who lived almost entirely separate from the rest of the world. These outsiders were often met with polite, distant greetings, but the reception they received was always cold, unwelcoming. Some left with more questions than answers, feeling that they had glimpsed something forbidden, something not meant to be understood. However, there were those among the outsiders who were not easily deterred. Journalists, historians, and even scientists, people curious to understand what was really going on in the village, began to make their way into the remote hills, hoping to uncover the truth about this strange family. It was around this time that the first reports of abnormal behavior began to surface. The family's health, both physical and mental, was brought into question. It was said that the children of the family, though raised in a stable and nurturing environment, exhibited unusual traits, a marked lack of social development, strange physical deformities, and at times, irrational behavior. These reports came from those who had ventured into the village and from outsiders who had been familiar with the family's reputation long before. The medical community, always on the lookout for abnormal patterns, began to take a keen interest in the family's situation. The first inquiries came from doctors who had heard rumors about the family's isolation and their refusal to intermarry outside their bloodline. Many wondered whether the family's seemingly perfect isolation was, in fact, a form of genetic imprisonment. There were early signs that inbreeding, a practice that had been normalized within the family for generations, was starting to have profound consequences. The physical anomalies observed in the children were no longer seen as merely coincidental. It was suggested, quietly at first, that the family's isolation had led to a narrowing of their genetic pool, which in turn had resulted in the manifesting of genetic disorders. What was once a subtle issue, a child born with a slight deformity or a mental quirk, was now growing more pronounced. As doctors and researchers began to visit the village, they made startling discoveries. The family members, although they looked like ordinary people, carried within them the marks of generations of insular living. Some of the children were born with cognitive impairments, their minds clouded by the effects of limited genetic diversity. Others exhibited strange physical traits, such as crooked spines, asymmetrical faces, and unusually long limbs. These were not random occurrences. They were the unmistakable signs of inbreeding. Some of the more disturbing symptoms involved severe mental health issues, including instances of violent outbursts and unexplained paranoia. What was once thought to be a mere oddity, an eccentricity rooted in tradition, was beginning to take on a far darker and more tragic form. But it wasn't just the health of the children that raised alarm. There were stories, growing in number, of strange occurrences at the family home. Those brave enough to approach the house often spoke of an eerie atmosphere that surrounded it. The windows, always closed and dark, seemed to hide something within. People who had ventured too close at night spoke of strange sounds emanating from inside, low murmurs, and the unsettling sound of footsteps that echoed through the thick walls of the stone structure. Some claimed to have seen figures moving behind the curtains, their faces distorted and gaunt, as though they were trapped within the house, unable to escape. Despite these reports, no one could ever confirm what was truly happening within the walls of the family home. Those who lived in the village itself did not speak openly about the family's health issues, nor did they acknowledge the darker rumors that had begun to circulate. Perhaps it was out of respect for the family's long-standing presence in the village, or perhaps it was due to fear that acknowledging the truth would lead to unwanted attention from the outside world. But no matter the reason, the villagers remained silent. It was as if they had all come to accept the family's isolation, the strange behavior, and the growing abnormalities as just another part of the fabric of their lives. But eventually, silence became impossible to maintain. As the health of the family deteriorated, and the true extent of the genetic damage became apparent, outside interest in the family grew stronger. It was not long before experts in genetics and medicine began to flock to the village. It was as if the family had become an irresistible mystery, one that demanded to be understood, analyzed, and dissected. For the first time, the family's isolation was no longer just a curiosity, it was a medical anomaly, a dark mystery that could not be ignored. The family's unwillingness to engage with the outside world was no longer seen as simply a quirk of rural life. It was now viewed as something more troubling. The outside world had begun to shine a light on a long-held secret, and the repercussions of this attention would be far-reaching. The family had unknowingly sealed their fate, their desire to remain untouched by the modern world having resulted in a tragic cycle that no one could have foreseen. The questions about the family's health were no longer theoretical. They were urgent, they were real, and they were impossible to ignore. The isolated family that had once been a relic of the past was now a living example of the dangers of extreme isolation, a family caught in a genetic web from which there was no escape. And as the family's secrets began to unfold, so did the truth about their fate. The medical community, now fully aware of the ramifications of their isolation, began to look at the family not just as an anomaly but as a cautionary tale, a living example of what can happen when generations of genetic material are confined within an insular group. The bloodline that had remained pure for so long was now irrevocably damaged, and with it, the family's future was sealed. The tragedy, in all its forms, had only just begun. The whispers surrounding the family's peculiar way of life and the strange, unsettling behavior of its members had begun to ripple out, drawing attention from far beyond the borders of the village. What had once been seen as an isolated oddity, a curious tradition of inbreeding and insular existence, was now a focal point for anyone with a vested interest in genetic health, anthropology, or the darker side of human history. The family, in their complete isolation, had unwittingly become an emblem of something much larger, an example of the risks of extreme genetic isolation, a case study of human nature's limits when confined to the same narrow gene pool over generations. At first, the interest from outsiders was polite, an academic curiosity, a question to be answered through research, observation, and examination. However, as time went on and the stories of the family's deteriorating health spread, the outside world began to see them not just as an oddity but as a tragedy unfolding in real time. Scientists, doctors, and researchers from across Spain and even from abroad began to arrive in the area. They were drawn to the family's unusual genetic situation, hoping to gain insight into the effects of inbreeding and the long-term consequences of living in isolation. What they found when they arrived was not only a family whose physical and mental health were deteriorating, but also a community bound by the unspoken rules of tradition, one that refused to confront the consequences of their actions. The first outsiders to arrive were, of course, doctors, medical professionals who had heard the rumors and decided to investigate. What they found was shocking, but also predictable. The family members, though outwardly appearing normal, carried the undeniable marks of genetic degradation. They were afflicted by an array of disorders, physical deformities, cognitive impairments, and mental health problems that were all too familiar to those versed in the effects of inbreeding. Children were born with malformed limbs, crooked spines, and faces that appeared slightly out of proportion. Mental faculties were often compromised, leading to erratic behavior, emotional instability, and in some cases, a complete inability to function normally in society. As the symptoms became more pronounced, it was clear that the family was not merely unlucky or suffering from isolated medical conditions. They were the victims of generations of isolation and intermarriage. The medical community had long been aware of the risks associated with inbreeding, but seeing it firsthand, in such a concentrated form, was a revelation. Geneticists and doctors began to theorize about the specific consequences of such extreme isolation. It wasn't just the physical deformities or the mental issues that were apparent, it was the sheer scope of the damage that had been done to the family's gene pool. Over generations, the family's bloodline had become so confined, so narrow, that the genetic material they were passing down was deteriorating. Mutations, once rare, had become commonplace. The family's isolation had essentially trapped them in a loop, with no new genetic material to introduce diversity and combat the harmful effects of inbreeding. At the same time, anthropologists began to take notice of the cultural implications of the family situation. In a world that was rapidly modernizing, where globalization and mobility were becoming the norm, the family's refusal to interact with outsiders seemed almost like a relic of a time long past. Their rigid adherence to tradition, their rejection of the broader societal norms, spoke to a deep-seated fear of the outside world. The family's way of life had been shaped by centuries of isolation, and now that isolation was beginning to show its consequences. Anthropologists marveled at the lengths to which the family had gone to preserve their bloodline, but they also saw the darker side of this preservation. What was once seen as an effort to maintain purity had now become an insurmountable burden, one that threatened to destroy the very thing the family had fought to protect. As researchers delved deeper into the family's history, they uncovered a pattern of behavior that had been passed down from generation to generation. The family's belief in the purity of their bloodline had not just been a matter of tradition, it was rooted in deep-seated fears and beliefs. For centuries, the family had convinced itself that their isolation from the outside world was not just a necessity but a sacred duty. Their refusal to marry outside the family was framed not as a choice, but as a protection, a safeguard against contamination, a way to preserve their ancestral legacy. The patriarchs of the family, with their unyielding commitment to maintaining this bloodline, had passed down a belief system that placed their lineage above all else. Outsiders were seen as a threat to this sacred purity, and any attempt to integrate with the broader community was seen as an affront to the family's existence. What was perhaps the most unsettling of all was the family's refusal to acknowledge the consequences of their actions. Despite the mounting evidence of genetic harm, the family continued to follow their traditions without question. There were no public discussions about the deteriorating health of their children or the obvious signs of inbreeding. The patriarch, who had always ruled his household with a firm hand, continued to keep his family secluded from the outside world, convinced that they were doing what was best for the family. In many ways, the family's isolation had become a self-perpetuating cycle, where the refusal to acknowledge the damage done only allowed the harm to continue. The villagers, for their part, remained largely silent, as if complicit in the family's refusal to confront the truth. The community, long used to the family's insularity, had come to accept their ways as part of the landscape. What they saw as an old-fashioned practice, one that had been a part of their culture for centuries, was, in reality, a dangerous form of denial. As time passed, the outside world's attention only intensified. News of the family's plight spread to medical journals and academic circles, where it was discussed as an extreme example of what could go wrong when a community chose to remain isolated from the rest of society. The family's case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of genetic isolation, of how deeply ingrained traditions can sometimes blind people to the realities of science and medicine. But for the family, this outside scrutiny was nothing but an intrusion. They saw themselves as the guardians of their own history, the protectors of a bloodline that had survived for centuries. The family's stubbornness, their refusal to accept the help or advice of outsiders, only served to deepen the tragedy. As researchers and doctors continued to document the physical and mental toll the family had endured, they began to discuss the ethical implications of their situation. Should the family be forced to confront the consequences of their isolation? Or was it enough that they had survived for so long in such a closed-off existence? Was it right for outsiders to intervene in a community's way of life, even if that life was slowly unraveling under the weight of its own traditions? These were questions that loomed large as the family's story became more widely known. And yet, despite the ethical dilemmas, the truth remained clear. The family's way of life had become unsustainable. Their refusal to accept the modern world, to allow their bloodline to mix with others, had created a genetic disaster. They were paying the price for their isolation, and there seemed to be no way to reverse the damage that had been done. The villagers, too, began to feel the weight of the family's tragedy. Many of them had grown up with the family, living side by side in the same small community. They had known the family's children, had watched them grow up, and had seen the subtle changes in their health and behavior. But there had always been an unspoken agreement. What happened behind the closed doors of the family's home was their business. The villagers, though curious and perhaps even concerned, had remained largely passive, content to let the family live in their isolation. Now, with the truth of the family's genetic decline laid bare for all to see, the villagers were left to grapple with their own complicity. Had they been wrong to remain silent? Had they failed to intervene, to offer help when it might have mattered? The family's story, once a quiet mystery, had become a tragedy that could no longer be ignored. As the years passed, and as the effects of inbreeding continued to ravage their bloodline, the outside world's curiosity shifted to something more urgent: concern, outrage, and sorrow. The family had become a living example of the dangers of extreme isolation, of the price one pays for refusing to adapt, to change, to evolve. In their stubborn adherence to tradition, they had inadvertently sealed their own fate, and in doing so, they had become a symbol of the destructive power of isolation, one that no amount of tradition or bloodline could preserve. The family's tragedy was not just a personal one, but a cautionary tale for all those who chose to live outside the bounds of society, in defiance of the forces of progress and change. The decline of the family had become a slow-moving tragedy, one that could not be ignored any longer. The once immense isolation they had clung to was now their greatest burden, and every attempt to maintain the traditions that had defined them for centuries seemed to only hasten their downfall. The patriarch, whose iron grip had once kept his family's customs intact, was now aging, his health failing, and the weight of his decisions became heavier by the day. His refusal to seek help, or even to acknowledge the growing evidence of harm, was now seen by outsiders as not just stubbornness but a tragic form of denial. The family's refusal to adapt, to allow change, or to even entertain the possibility of a future outside their bloodline, meant that the crisis they were facing was inevitable. It was in the later years of the patriarch's life that the cracks in the family structure became impossible to hide. The family, still living in the same house, surrounded by the same isolation, had begun to visibly deteriorate. The children, now adults, exhibited more severe signs of the genetic toll their family had suffered. There were those who had been born with physical deformities so striking that it was difficult for even the most compassionate individuals to ignore. Crooked spines, twisted limbs, and faces distorted by asymmetry had become common, and as the years wore on, the physical damage became more apparent. But it was not only the physical deformities that had begun to draw attention, it was the mental and emotional toll that had become just as visible. In the most extreme cases, the family members exhibited erratic behavior, marked by irrational outbursts, severe mood swings, and in some cases, a complete detachment from reality. The younger generation of the family, who had been born into the same traditions and had known nothing else, struggled to understand the changes happening around them. For them, the world outside was a distant memory, something they had only heard of in the stories of outsiders who had passed through the village over the years. They had never known anything but the house, the fields, and the narrow, winding paths that led to nowhere but the hills. They were isolated from everything, the village, the world, and even each other in ways that no one had fully understood until now. As the patriarch's health continued to deteriorate, his power over the family weakened. His once commanding presence, the unshakable belief that his way was the only way, had begun to wane, but there was no one to replace him. His children, many of whom were suffering from the effects of inbreeding themselves, were ill-equipped to handle the responsibilities that came with the family's legacy. The eldest son, once groomed to carry on the family's traditions and leadership, was now plagued by his own set of health issues, both physical and mental. His mind, once sharp and full of determination, was clouded by the genetic conditions that had slowly taken root in his family over generations. The younger children, who had looked up to him as a role model, began to spiral into their own dysfunctions, as they too became afflicted by the same genetic disorders. By now, the family's secrecy had begun to unravel. The walls that had once kept outsiders at bay were no longer sufficient to contain the reality of what was happening inside. Word had spread far and wide, and the growing number of reports, medical observations, and inquiries from both researchers and outsiders had made it impossible for the family to remain untouched. Their isolation had, in many ways, become their greatest curse. In the eyes of the outside world, the family had gone from being a mysterious oddity to a tragic case of self-destruction. There was a deep sadness that had permeated the situation, a sadness that went beyond the obvious health problems of the family members. It was the sorrow of a family that had been so determined to preserve its bloodline, its traditions, and its isolation that it had lost sight of the very things that made life meaningful: connection, change, and adaptability. The family had become a symbol of something deeper, a warning to those who might be too focused on preserving the past that they could destroy their future in the process. The village, for the most part, had kept its distance from the growing crisis, but there were those who could no longer turn a blind eye. The effects of the family's isolation were too visible, too undeniable. As the family's health continued to decline, a few brave souls from the village began to take action. They attempted to offer assistance, medical help, social support, even the possibility of breaking the cycle that had trapped the family for so long. But every attempt was met with resistance. The family, though suffering, continued to believe in the sanctity of their bloodline, in the power of their isolation. They would rather face the consequences of their choices than admit that they had made a mistake. The patriarch, in his last years, clung desperately to the belief that his family's way of life had been the right one, that their refusal to mingle with the outside world had been justified, that the bloodline should remain pure above all else. He refused to acknowledge that their world, their ways, had brought them to this point. Yet, even in their continued denial, the family could not escape the reality that the consequences of their actions were now irreversible. The family's members, who had once been part of a tight-knit, almost insular group, had grown increasingly fractured. The eldest son, struggling with his own health issues, tried to take on the role of leader, but it was clear that he was not up to the task. His siblings, many of whom were suffering from physical and mental health issues themselves, lacked the strength to help. The once proud family had become a shadow of its former self, each member dealing with their own personal struggles. The house, once a symbol of strength and tradition, had become a prison, its walls closing in on them, echoing with the silence of lost opportunities, unspoken truths, and the weight of generations of choices that could never be undone. As outsiders continued to study the family, it became clear that the damage was far-reaching. The genetic issues that had been passed down through the generations were no longer isolated to just a few individuals. They had permeated the entire bloodline. Researchers, now with access to more advanced tools and technology, began to conduct genetic tests, and the results were alarming. The family's gene pool had been so restricted for so long that harmful mutations had proliferated. These mutations, once rare, were now widespread. The genetic diversity that could have protected the family, that could have allowed them to survive and thrive in the modern world, had been wiped out, leaving only the stark reality of genetic stagnation. But even as the family's situation became increasingly dire, the patriarch continued to refuse help. His pride, the very thing that had kept the family isolated for so long, now stood in the way of any potential recovery. He believed that outside influence, whether it be medical intervention, genetic counseling, or even social integration, was a threat to the family's way of life. For him, their isolation was not just a choice, it was a sacred duty. To admit that their way of life had been wrong, to allow someone from outside to come in and offer assistance, would have been an unforgivable betrayal. And yet, even as the family remained in denial, the outside world continued to push forward. Medical professionals and researchers made their findings public, sparking debates on the ethics of inbreeding, the dangers of isolation, and the consequences of such extreme insularity. The family's plight became a symbol of a much larger issue, the tension between tradition and progress, between isolation and integration. The outside world, once seen as a threat, now seemed like a lifeline, a world filled with possibilities, solutions, and opportunities for change that the family had long rejected.